All right, Smoky. Together. Pull. Bark. Bark.
Never seen anything like it. Impressive.
Let's go. Stay sharp. Good pace.
His wife took everything in the divorce, leaving the aging veteran with nothing but a rusted truck and his loyal German shepherd, Smoky. Banished to a crumbling Appalachian cabin, he believed his life was quietly over. But days after arriving in the isolated wilderness, his devoted dog began frantically tearing at the earth behind the decaying barn. What the shepherd unearthed beneath decades of moss and soil wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was a staggering secret that would completely rewrite his future and make the woman who destroyed him deeply regret her betrayal. Before we uncover this mystery, tell me in the comments where you're watching this story from today. The rain had been falling since the early hours of the morning, a relentless gray sheet that washed the color from the city streets and mirrored the quiet desolation settling inside Jax Harlan's chest. By the time his heavy military-issue boots stepped out of his battered pickup truck and onto the slick, oil-stained asphalt of the courthouse parking lot, the sky had bruised into the shade of wet concrete. He stood there for a long moment, the cold drizzle soaking into the shoulders of his faded olive-drab army jacket, a jacket that had seen more sand, blood, and history than anyone inside the towering glass building could ever possibly comprehend. Inside the warm cabin of the truck, sitting upright in the passenger seat with the quiet dignity of a seasoned soldier, was Smoky. The German shepherd's intelligent amber eyes followed Jax's every movement through the water-streaked windshield. Smoky did not whine or pace. He simply watched, his ears swiveled forward, sensing the heavy, invisible burden his handler carried today. Jax reached back through the open door, his calloused hand resting gently against the thick, dark fur of the dog's neck. Just a formality. "Buddy," Jax murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the drumming rain. "We will be out of here before you know it." Smoky's thick tail thumped a single, rhythmic beat against the worn upholstery, a silent promise that no matter what happened inside that building, he would be right here waiting. Jax pulled up his collar, closed the door with a metallic clatter, and began the long walk toward the looming courthouse. At 68 years old, Jax Harlan still moved with the disciplined, unyielding posture of a career combat engineer, though the decades of grueling deployments had carved deep, rugged lines into his weathered face and left him with a severe, throbbing ache in his right knee, a permanent souvenir from an explosive blast in a desert, thousands of miles away. Inside the law offices, the air was suffocatingly dry, smelling of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and the bitter tang of severed ties. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a mindless, irritating hum that reminded Jax of the medical tents overseas. He wiped the rain from his face and limped slightly down the long, carpeted hallway, believing, perhaps naively, that this meeting was merely a temporary pause. After 35 years of marriage, through countless deployments, missed birthdays, and quiet homecomings, he assumed this was just a separation, a cooling-off period required by a complicated season of their lives. That fleeting illusion shattered the moment he pushed open the heavy oak door to the conference room. Elena Harlan was already seated at the far end of a vast, polished mahogany table. She did not look up when the door clicked shut. Her hair was styled with immaculate, expensive precision, and she wore a sharp, tailored slate-gray suit that looked as unyielding as armor. Resting on the table in front of her was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Sitting directly beside her was a man Jax had never seen before, a younger, immaculately groomed man with a predatory stillness about him, wearing a silk tie and a condescending half-smile. This was Julian Vance. Jax paused, offering a small, deeply uncertain smile that felt completely foreign on his hardened face. "Morning, Elena," he offered, his voice carrying the quiet hope of a man who still believed in the vows he had taken 3 decades prior. When she finally lifted her gaze, the absolute emptiness in her eyes struck Jax harder than any physical blow he had ever taken in combat. There was no warmth, no shared history, no lingering trace of the young woman who had once cried holding his hand before his first deployment. Her expression was completely flat, a mask of bored indifference. "Jax," she replied, her tone as brittle as winter ice. Julian Vance cleared his throat with a practiced, hollow politeness. Mr. Harlan, please, have a seat. We have a considerable amount of ground to cover this morning. Jax lowered himself into the plush leather chair across from them, feeling distinctly out of place as rainwater dripped from the frayed cuff of his jacket onto the pristine carpet. The atmosphere in the room was thick with a silent, suffocating hostility. Julian opened the leather folder, the crisp sound of turning pages echoing loudly in the quiet room, and slid a monumental stack of densely typed legal documents across the reflective surface of the table. Mr. Harlan, Julian began, his voice dripping with rehearsed legal detachment. Your wife has filed a petition for the absolute and total dissolution of the marriage. Jax blinked, the words struggling to find purchase in his mind. The hum of the lights suddenly felt overwhelmingly loud. I'm sorry. What? A divorce? He asked, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked desperately at the woman across the table, searching for the punchline to a terrible joke. Elena, what exactly is this? You told me over the phone this was just separation paperwork to sort out the finances. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture radiating an impenetrable coldness. That was before I had a chance to fully evaluate my future. Jax. I changed my mind. The walls of the room seemed to press inward, the air growing dangerously thin. Changed your mind about what? Jax's voice trembled with a rare, naked vulnerability. About throwing away 35 years? Julian smoothly intervened, sliding another intimidatingly thick document toward Jax. These specific papers, Mr. Harlan, outline the proposed and finalized division of all marital assets. I suggest you review them carefully. Jax stared blindly at the pages, the dense paragraphs of legal jargon blurring together into meaningless shapes. I do not understand, he whispered. Elena folded her perfectly manicured hands atop the table. I am quite certain that you do. No, Elena, I really don't, Jax countered, a spark of the old soldier's defiance finally igniting in his chest. Her voice remained perfectly level, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Jax, let us be realistic. You have not worked a conventional job in years. You spend your days sitting in that dusty garage, fixing broken lawnmowers, and talking to that oversized dog. Meanwhile, I have been actively managing our investment portfolios, maintaining this household's social standing, and building actual wealth. The heat of 1,000 desert suns flared in Jax's chest. His jaw tightened until the muscles ached. I served this country for 32 years. Elena, I built bridges, I cleared roads, and I buried good men. Yes, she replied, without a single ounce of empathy. And then you retired, and you stopped moving forward. I was blown up. Elena, my knee, I am fully aware of your medical history, she cut him off smoothly. Julian tapped his expensive pen against the table, drawing the attention back to the documents. Mr. Harlan, per the terms of this settlement, your military pension and your disability benefits will, of course, remain entirely yours. However, the primary residence in the suburbs, the secondary investment accounts, the joint savings, and all shared equity assets are legally and demonstrably tied to Mrs. Harlan's direct financial contributions and market investments over the past decade. Jax's head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Elena with a look of profound, devastating realization. What exactly does that mean? It means, Elena said coolly, looking him dead in the eye, that I am the one who built the financial stability in this marriage, and therefore, I'm the one taking it. Jax stared at her, the silence stretching into an eternity. He remembered the countless, terrifying nights she had slept safely in a comfortable bed while he was shivering in mountain outposts or sweating in armored convoys. He remembered the grueling physical therapy he endured just to walk through their front door again. You built it, he repeated quietly, the words hollow. You have been living off government checks for years, she stated, her tone dismissive. I am moving on to a different caliber of life. Julian and I have plans, she corrected smoothly, placing a hand briefly near the lawyer's arm. Jax's jaw set like granite. That dog you mentioned, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly calm, was trained beside me during combat deployments. He has more honor in his left paw than anyone sitting on your side of this table. Elena waved her hand as if swatting away a fly. Exactly my point. Jax. You are living in the past. Julian slid a final page forward, highlighting a signature line with the tip of his pen. This settlement generously allows you to retain your personal vehicle, your clothing, and your dog. Mrs. Harlan will maintain the entirety of the real estate and financial portfolios. It is incredibly comprehensive. Jax finally looked down at the paper. The numbers were staggering, representing an entire lifetime of savings, sacrifices, and shared dreams, all being legally funneled away from him. His voice was barely a whisper. After 35 years, this is it? You take everything, and I walk away with a truck and a dog? Elena did not blink, nor did she flinch. Yes, Jax leaned back heavily in the leather chair. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly morphed, twisting in his mind. For a terrifying, disorienting second, he wasn't in a sterile law office in the city. The smell of expensive cologne was replaced by the acrid stench of burning diesel and copper. The polished table vanished, replaced by the violently shaking interior of a Humvee. His heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. He closed his eyes tight, gripped the heavy armrests of his chair, and forced his breathing to slow, utilizing the grounding techniques he had practiced 1,000 times. He opened his eyes. The room returned to sharp, painful focus. You're entirely serious about this, he stated. Not as a question, but as a final assessment of the battlefield. I am, Elena replied. And there is absolutely no fixing this. Silence fell over the room like a heavy shroud. Jax realized, with a chilling finality, that he was looking at a complete stranger. The woman he had loved was dead and gone, replaced by this cold, calculating entity. He reached forward, his calloused hand picking up the heavy metal pen. Without another word, without a single tear or plea, he signed his name on the line, effectively erasing his own existence from her world. He stood up, the chairs scraping loudly against the floor, turned his back on them, and walked out of the room. The meeting ended without shouting, without dramatic exits, just the quiet, devastating sound of a door clicking shut on 35 years of history. When Jax emerged from the courthouse, the rain had intensified into a heavy, driving downpour. Across the vast, desolate expanse of the parking lot, the old pickup truck waited. Inside, Smoky was sitting exactly where Jax had left him, upright, vigilant, his golden eyes locked onto the courthouse doors. As Jax pulled open the heavy steel door of the truck, Smoky immediately leaned across the center console, pressing his warm, wet nose against Jax's cheek, emitting a low, comforting whine that spoke volumes of unspoken understanding. Jax tossed his 2 worn, canvas military duffel bags into the cramped space behind the seats. He slid behind the steering wheel, the worn leather familiar and comforting against his back. He did not start the engine right away. He simply sat there, staring blankly through the windshield as the rain hammered against the glass. The sheer totality of his loss crashed over him. His home, his savings, his entire perceived future gone in the span of 30 minutes. Smoky shifted his weight, placing his large, heavy head gently but firmly onto Jax's right shoulder, anchoring the old soldier to the present moment. Jax reached up, his fingers burying themselves deep into the dog's thick fur. His voice cracked, rough with unshed emotion. Well, Smoky. I guess it really is just you and me against the world now. Smoky remained perfectly still, a silent, immovable pillar of loyalty. Jax turned the key. The old, reliable engine roared to life, a deep, mechanical growl that seemed to challenge the dreary city around them. He threw the truck into gear and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the gray concrete, the towering glass buildings, and the shattered remnants of his past in the rearview mirror. He did not know it yet, but the long, winding road stretching out ahead of him beneath the weeping sky was not leading him toward an end, but toward a profound beginning. It was leading him away from a world of hollow greed and back toward the wild, ancient embrace of the Appalachian Mountains, back to a forgotten plot of land his father had once fiercely guarded, and back to a monumental secret waiting silently in the dark earth, waiting for the one dog intelligent enough to uncover it. The windshield wipers slapped a rhythmic, hypnotic beat against the glass as the truck left the sprawling city limits of Charleston. The dense, suffocating clusters of office parks and suburban developments slowly gave way to rolling, fog-draped hills. The tall steel radio towers faded, replaced by the imposing, ancient silhouettes of pine trees. Jax drove in absolute silence, the radio turned off, listening only to the steady hum of the tires on the wet pavement. Smoky sat tall in the passenger seat, acting as the ultimate sentry, his amber eyes watching the shifting landscape with keen interest. Hours passed as the elevation climbed. The air seeping through the truck's vents grew noticeably cooler, sharper, smelling of damp earth, decaying leaves, and wild pine. Jax turned the steering wheel, guiding the truck off the main interstate and onto a weathered, two-lane blacktop that wound its way like a dark ribbon deep into the heart of the Appalachian Ranges. A faded, moss-covered wooden sign flashed by the window, Appalachian Scenic Route. He had not driven this specific stretch of road in over 2 decades. Not since the cold, bitter morning he had buried his father. Back then, a younger Jax had stood over the fresh grave and promised himself he would return to restore the old, isolated family homestead. He had envisioned retiring there with Elena, fixing the rotting porch, and finding peace. But life, with its endless wars and deployments, had stolen that time, turning the mountain property into nothing more than a forgotten footnote on a legal document. The road narrowed drastically, the towering pines pressing in close on both sides, their heavy, dark branches forming a natural, arching tunnel over the asphalt. Jax rolled his window down a few inches, letting the biting mountain air rush into the cabin. The tension that had been gripping his neck and shoulders since the courtroom began, ever so slightly, to loosen its terrible hold. There was a raw, primal honesty to these mountains that the city could never replicate. Smoky stood up suddenly on the passenger seat, his front paws resting on the door panel as he pushed his nose toward the crack in the window. The dog inhaled deeply, his ears twitching as he processed 1,000 wild, untamed scents. Jax managed the faintest ghost of a smile, his hand resting on the shifter. "You smell that, buddy?" he murmured, the exhaustion heavy in his voice. "That's the sound of nobody bothering us ever again." The pavement abruptly ended, transitioning into a treacherous, rutted gravel road that aggressively shook the old truck. Tall, untamed weeds violently brushed against the side panels as Jax navigated the final, steep half-mile. He rounded a sharp, blind bend, and the dense forest suddenly parted, revealing a wide, overgrown clearing. Jax pressed the brake pedal, bringing the truck to a slow, grinding halt. The engine idled with a low rumble. He stared through the windshield at the place he had not laid eyes on in 20 years. The Harlan Mountain homestead. It was a place frozen in time, battered by the elements, and completely abandoned by the world. But to a man who had just lost everything, it looked exactly like sanctuary. The engine of the battered pickup truck gave one final exhausted shudder before falling completely silent, leaving Jax Harlan submerged in a profound heavy stillness that felt entirely alien after the chaotic noise of the city. He sat behind the steering wheel for a long time, his hands still gripping the worn leather, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the decaying remnants of his family's legacy. The Harlan homestead, which had once stood as a proud, sturdy testament to his father's relentless work ethic, now looked like a forgotten skeleton bleaching in the Appalachian sun. The once vibrant forest green paint of the cabin had blistered and peeled away, exposing the gray, weathered timber beneath. The front porch drooped heavily to the left, groaning under the weight of decades of accumulated snow and neglect. Across the overgrown yard, the large wooden barn leaned precariously, its roof missing several large patches of corrugated tin, looking as though a strong gust of mountain wind might finally bring it crashing down into the weeds. Jax let out a long, slow breath that fogged the cold glass in front of him. He pushed open the heavy steel door of the truck, the hinges screaming in protest, and stepped out into the knee-high, damp grass. The mountain air here was radically different from the valley below. It was painfully crisp, carrying the sharp medicinal scent of crushed pine needles, damp earth, and ancient decaying wood. Smoky hopped down from the passenger seat with a practiced athletic grace, his large paws hitting the soft dirt without a sound. Instantly, the German shepherd transitioned into a working state. His nose dropped low to the ground, his ears swiveled like radar dishes, and he began a methodical, expanding circle around the perimeter of the clearing, securing the area just as he had done in countless hostile environments across the globe. Jax watched the dog work, finding a strange, quiet comfort in the familiar routine. He pulled his heavy military duffel bags from the back of the cab, the canvas rough against his calloused hands. Slinging them over his broad shoulders, he began the slow, limping walk toward the cabin. Every step sent a dull, throbbing spike of pain shooting up from his shattered knee, a physical reminder of the explosive blast that had ended his military career. Just as Elena had ended their marriage, he climbed the 3 wooden steps leading up to the porch, testing each one carefully with his boot before committing his weight. The boards bowed and creaked ominously but held. Standing before the front door, he reached out and grasped the rusted, brass doorknob. It stubbornly resisted for a moment, fused by years of humidity and disuse, before finally giving way with a harsh, metallic grind. Jax pushed the door open, stepping over the threshold into the dim, stagnant interior. The air inside was thick and heavy, smelling powerfully of undisturbed dust, dry rot, and old memories. Shafts of pale, late-afternoon sunlight sliced through the grime-coated windows, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing lazily in the dead air. The layout of the cabin was exactly as his teenage mind remembered it, though the scale felt terribly small now. There was a modest central living space dominated by a massive, floor-to-ceiling river stone fireplace, a small kitchen alcove with a rusted cast-iron sink, and a short hallway leading to 2 cramped bedrooms. The furniture, a plaid sofa, a heavy oak dining table, and a few wooden chairs was all covered in thick, dusty canvas drop cloths, looking like lumpy, forgotten ghosts occupying the corners of the room. Jax dropped his heavy duffel bags onto the floorboards with a dull, resonant thud. The sound echoed through the empty cabin, violently underscoring the absolute isolation of his new reality. He stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing against his eardrums, and slowly unzipped his jacket. Just hours ago, he had been a man with a sprawling suburban home, a healthy retirement portfolio, and a wife he believed he would grow old alongside. Now, he was standing in a rotting shack in the middle of a primeval forest, owning nothing but the clothes on his back and the gear in his bags. The sheer magnitude of Elena's betrayal threatened to drag him under, a dark, suffocating tide of anger and profound sorrow pulling at his chest. A soft, rhythmic clicking of claws on the wooden floor broke the heavy silence. Smoky padded into the room, having finished his exterior patrol. The dog thoroughly sniffed the perimeter of the living room, investigating the corners, the cold stone of the fireplace, and the legs of the canvas-covered furniture. Satisfied that the immediate area was secure, Smoky walked directly to Jax, sitting squarely at the veteran's feet and looking up with those intelligent, unwavering amber eyes. "Perimeter clear, soldier?" Jax asked, his voice a raspy whisper in the quiet room. Smoky let out a low, affirmative huff, his tail brushing once against the dusty floorboards. Jax slowly lowered himself onto his haunches, ignoring the sharp protest of his ruined knee, and took the dog's large head in both of his hands. He buried his face in the thick, warm fur of Smoky's neck, breathing in the scent of rain and wild outdoors that the dog carried. For the first time since he had sat in that sterile, fluorescent-lit courtroom and watched his life be systematically dismantled by a man in a silk tie, Jax Harlan allowed his rigid composure to crack. He did not weep, for the military had trained the tears out of him long ago, but a ragged, heavy sigh tore itself from his throat, a sound carrying decades of exhausted grief. Smoky leaned his entire muscular weight against Jax's chest, offering a steady, physical anchor against the invisible storm raging inside the old soldier's mind. "They can take the money, Smoky," Jax murmured into the dog's coat. "They can take the house, and they can take the land down in the valley. But they could never understand this. They could never buy what you and I have." As the afternoon slowly bled into evening, the temperature outside plummeted, the mountain air turning dangerously bitter. Jax threw off his jacket and set to work, utilizing the ingrained, methodical discipline that had kept him alive in war zones. He stripped the canvas covers from the furniture, coughing as decades of dust plumed into the air. He found a rusted, heavy iron bucket under the kitchen sink and spent 20 minutes priming the old hand pump well in the yard until it finally spat out a stream of brown, metallic-smelling water that eventually ran clear and freezing cold. Using a dull hatchet he found hanging in the leaning barn, he chopped deadfall from the edge of the tree line, hauling armfuls of dry, brittle pine back to the cabin. By the time the sun fully slipped behind the towering, jagged ridges of the Appalachians, plunging the clearing into a deep, impenetrable blue twilight, Jax had successfully built a crackling fire in the massive stone hearth. The flames leapt and danced, casting long, flickering, orange shadows across the log walls, momentarily breathing a semblance of life back into the dead cabin. Jax dragged the heavy oak armchair directly in front of the hearth, wrapped himself in a worn, olive-drab wool blanket from his duffel, and extended his aching, stiff leg toward the radiating heat. Smoky immediately circled twice on the braided rug beside the chair before collapsing with a heavy sigh, his nose resting mere inches from the stone border of the fire, soaking in the warmth. For an hour, there was nothing but the comforting, organic sounds of the mountain night, the wind whistling a low, mournful tune through the cracks in the window frames, the occasional sharp pop of sap expanding in the burning logs, and the deep, steady rhythm of Smoky's breathing. Jax stared blankly into the hypnotic, shifting heart of the fire, letting his mind drift, trying desperately not to think about Elena, or the lawyer, or the empty bank accounts. But trauma, Jax knew intimately, was a patient and insidious predator. It did not attack when you were guarded and alert. It waited until you were exhausted, until the silence grew too heavy, until your defenses finally lowered in the dark. It started with a sound. A particularly large knot of wood in the fire suddenly ruptured with a sharp, violent crack. To a normal man, it was merely the sound of a burning log. But to Jax's deeply scarred nervous system, the sound instantly bypassed logic and struck the primal, raw center of his brain. In a fraction of a second, the comforting smell of burning pine vanished, replaced by the suffocating, toxic stench of burning diesel fuel, melting rubber, and vaporized copper. The walls of the cabin dissolved into the blinding, oppressive white heat of an Iraqi desert. Jax's breath hitched, trapping itself in his suddenly paralyzed lungs. His hands clamped onto the wooden armrests of his chair with bone-breaking force, his knuckles turning stark white. He wasn't in the mountains anymore. He was back in the convoy. The radio in his headset was screaming through bursts of chaotic static. The ground beneath his boots was violently vibrating. The phantom heat of a roadside explosion washed over his face, stealing the oxygen from the air. The invisible weight of the armored vehicle pressed down on his chest, crushing his ribs, drowning him in an ocean of panic and sand. He was hyperventilating now, taking short, ragged gasps of air that provided no relief. His heart hammered against his sternum like a machine gun. The flashback was pulling him under, threatening to completely sever his connection to reality. Suddenly, a heavy, solid weight forcefully wedged itself beneath his rigid, trembling arm. Smoky did not whimper or panic. Recognizing the physiological signs of a severe PTSD episode instantly, the rapid breathing, the muscle rigidity, the vacant, terrified stare, the highly trained German shepherd executed his duty with flawless precision. Smoky thrust his large, solid head forcefully under Jax's hand, violently breaking the veteran's frozen grip on the chair. Then, the 70-pound dog climbed fully onto Jax's lap, pressing his broad chest directly against Jax's violently heaving sternum, applying deep, grounding pressure therapy. Smoky let out a low, deep, vibrating rumble, not a growl of aggression, but a steady, resonating frequency designed to interrupt the chaotic signals in Jax's panicked brain. He began to drag his rough, warm tongue firmly across the side of Jax's face, right over the tight, strained muscles of his jaw. Smoky, Jax choked out, the word tearing painfully from his throat. The dog applied more pressure, his amber eyes locking onto Jax's wide, unseeing gaze, refusing to let the old soldier slip away into the dark corridors of his memory. Smoky's steady, incredibly calm heartbeat pulsed against Jax's chest, offering a biological metronome, a physical anchor point in the present moment. Slowly, agonizingly, the oppressive heat of the desert began to recede. The phantom smell of burning rubber faded, replaced once again by the scent of pine and wood smoke. The roaring static in Jax's ears quieted, allowing the gentle whistling of the mountain wind to return. Jax blinked heavily, his vision clearing, the rough log walls of his father's cabin solidifying around him once more. He slumped back into the chair, his entire body trembling violently with the sudden, exhausted release of adrenaline. He wrapped his thick, scarred arms tightly around the dog's muscular torso, burying his face in the fur along Smoky's spine. His breathing gradually synced with the dog's, slowing down, deepening, returning to a normal rhythm. "I'm here," Jax whispered, his voice incredibly fragile. "I'm back. I'm right here, buddy." Smoky held his position for several more minutes, waiting until the micro-tremors in Jax's hands completely subsided before carefully climbing down from his lap. The dog did not return to his spot by the fire. Instead, he sat right beside the arm of the chair, resting his heavy chin directly on Jax's knee, his eyes looking up with a look of fierce, unconditional devotion. Jax reached down, his fingers gently tracing the outline of the dog's ears. The judge in the city had ruled that Elena was entitled to the bank accounts, the investments, and the suburban real estate because she had built the value. But as Jax sat in the dim, flickering light of the decaying cabin, his hand resting on the only living creature that had ever truly dragged him back from the edge of hell, he realized the judge had been entirely wrong. Elena had walked away with mere paper and numbers. Jax had walked away with the only thing in the world that actually held real, undeniable value. "She thinks she broke me." "Smoky," Jax said quietly, the firelight reflecting in his weary eyes. "She thinks sending us out here was a death sentence." He looked around the dusty, quiet room, the ghosts of his father's hard work surrounding him. A newfound, stubborn resolve, forged in the fires of survival, began to harden in his chest. But she forgot one extremely important detail. Engineers don't break when things fall apart. We just rebuild. The fire slowly burned down to glowing, red-hot embers as the long night stretched on. Jax eventually moved to the small back bedroom, throwing his sleeping bag over the ancient, sagging mattress that his father had once slept on. Smoky took his customary position across the threshold of the open doorway, acting as the ultimate, unbreachable barrier between Jax and the outside world. Jax fell into a deep, dreamless exhaustion. But sometime deep in the darkest hour of the morning, just before the false dawn, Smoky's ears suddenly snapped forward. The dog lifted his head, his golden eyes wide and alert in the pitch-black cabin. He did not detect a threat. There was no scent of a wolf or bear on the wind. Instead, he heard something else. A faint, hollow settling of earth. A strange, unnatural resonance echoing deep beneath the soil of the hill rising sharply behind the cabin. Smoky stood up slowly, silently padding to the back window. He stared intently through the dirty glass at the moonlit hillside, his nose flaring, his instincts screaming that something massive, metallic, and ancient was buried just out of sight. He let out a barely audible whine, his thick tail going rigid. He would not wake his handler now, for the old soldier desperately needed his rest. But as the sun began to peek over the Appalachian ridges, Smoky knew exactly where he needed to go. The earth was hiding a secret, and the loyal dog was determined to tear the mountain apart until he found it. The morning arrived not with the gentle warmth of a welcoming spring, but with the sharp, biting frost of a mountain environment that had not yet surrendered entirely to the changing of the seasons. A pale, ghostly ribbon of dawn sunlight crept slowly over the jagged Appalachian ridges, spilling a cold, luminescent glow into the overgrown clearing behind the old Harlan cabin. Heavy, crystalline dew clung stubbornly to the tall, neglected grass, and the crisp, thin air carried the distinct, invigorating scent of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of the previous night's rain. Inside the dimly lit cabin, Jax Harlan woke to the quiet, dying crackle of the embers in the massive stone fireplace. For a long, disorienting moment, he lay perfectly still on the sagging, ancient mattress in the back bedroom, staring up at the water-stained wooden ceiling, waiting for the heavy machinery of his mind to process his surroundings. Then, with the brutal efficiency of a physical blow, the agonizing memories of the previous 48 hours returned. The sterile courtroom, the soulless documents, Elena's completely hollow eyes, the realization that he had been legally and emotionally erased from his own existence. Jax exhaled a long, ragged breath that materialized as a faint cloud of white mist in the freezing air of the bedroom. He pushed the heavy, olive-drab wool blanket aside and forced himself into a sitting position. Instantly, his ruined right knee screamed in hot, blinding protest, the damaged nerves radiating a deep, throbbing ache that shot straight up his thigh and into his lower back. Yeah, I hear you, Jax muttered under his breath, his voice rough and gravelly with sleep, gently massaging the scarred tissue around his kneecap. He expected to feel the comforting, heavy weight of Smoky resting against his good leg, or to see the large German shepherd standing diligently guard at the bedroom threshold as he always did. But as Jax's eyes adjusted to the pale morning light, he realized the doorway was entirely empty. The cabin was utterly silent, devoid of the familiar clicking of claws on the hardwood floor or the soft, rhythmic sound of canine breathing. A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline, an old, ingrained reflex from his combat days, hit Jax's bloodstream. He threw on his faded flannel shirt, hastily laced up his scuffed leather combat boots, and grabbed his heavy jacket, stepping quickly out of the bedroom. The living room was empty. The front door, which he had securely latched the night before, was standing slightly ajar, a sliver of freezing mountain wind blowing through the crack. Smoky had evidently nudged it open to get outside. Jax stepped out onto the sagging, creaking front porch, his eyes immediately scanning the tree line with practiced, tactical precision. "Smoky," he called out, his voice echoing loudly against the dense wall of pine trees surrounding the property. There was no immediate bark in response, no familiar rustle of underbrush, no flash of black and tan fur bounding happily across the frosted grass. Jax's heart rate quickened slightly. He walked down the wooden steps, ignoring the sharp pain in his leg, and began tracking the dog's large paw prints in the wet, muddy soil of the driveway. The tracks did not lead toward the dangerous, winding mountain road, nor did they head toward the dense, uncharted depths of the surrounding forest where wolves and bears roamed. Instead, the deep impressions in the mud bypassed the crumbling wooden barn entirely and led directly toward the steep, moss-covered hill that rose sharply directly behind the cabin. Jax followed the trail, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen weeds. As he rounded the corner of the decaying barn, he finally spotted him, halfway up the steep incline, surrounded by a thick, tangled overgrowth of thorny blackberry bushes and ancient ferns. Smoky was working. He wasn't casually sniffing the ground, and he certainly wasn't chasing a terrified rabbit or a burrowing groundhog. The highly trained German shepherd was digging with a furious, single-minded intensity that Jax had not witnessed since their days clearing highly dangerous, explosive-laden routes in the scorching deserts of the Middle East. Clumps of damp, dark mountain soil, tangled tree roots, and shredded green moss flew through the air behind the dog in a chaotic, continuous arc as his powerful front paws tore relentlessly into the earth. Smoky's head was buried deep in the expanding trench, his muscular shoulders bunching and flexing with every desperate, violent scrape of his claws. He was panting heavily, emitting short, sharp huffs of exertion, completely consumed by an invisible objective buried beneath the surface. Jax frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in genuine confusion. "Smoky. Fall in. Buddy. What in the world are you doing up there?" The command, which usually resulted in instant, unquestioning obedience from the disciplined animal, was completely ignored. Smoky did not even pause to look back. The dog simply dug faster, his claws scraping furiously against something buried in the dirt, as if he were racing against an invisible, rapidly ticking clock. A profound sense of unease settled deeply into Jax's stomach. He knew this dog better than he knew himself. Smoky was not a hyperactive puppy prone to destructive boredom. He was a decorated, highly decorated veteran of war. He possessed a terrifyingly sharp intellect and an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to detect anomalies in his environment. If Smoky was digging with this level of frantic desperation, it meant there was something fundamentally wrong, or fundamentally important, hidden beneath that soil. Jax began the slow, painful climb up the slippery, frost-coated hillside, utilizing the thick trunks of young pine trees to pull himself upward and take the agonizing weight off his bad knee. The tall, wet weeds aggressively soaked the bottom of his denim jeans as he finally crested the small ridge and approached the furiously digging dog. "Hey, easy, soldier. Stand down," Jax commanded, his voice firmer this time, carrying the undeniable authority of a commanding officer. Smoky finally paused, his chest heaving violently, his dark snout completely coated in wet, black mud. He looked up at Jax, his amber eyes wide, intensely focused, and completely devoid of playfulness. The dog let out a sharp, commanding bark, then deliberately slammed his right paw against the bottom of the deep, ragged hole he had excavated. Clink. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet morning air. It was not the dull, hollow thud of a paw striking a buried boulder, nor was it the soft, yielding crunch of hitting a rotting tree stump. It was a sharp, distinct, utterly unmistakable metallic ring. Jax instantly froze. Every single combat instinct, honed over 30 years of military engineering, violently surged to the forefront of his mind. Metal buried in the middle of an isolated, overgrown forest was rarely a good sign. In his previous life, it usually meant an improvised explosive device, an unexploded artillery shell, or a buried weapons cache. He dropped slowly to his knees beside the panting German shepherd, ignoring the icy mud seeping rapidly through the fabric of his jeans. He reached his bare, calloused hand into the freezing, newly turned earth. His thick fingers brushed past the severed, bleeding roots of a pine tree and touched something impossibly cold, perfectly flat and rigidly unyielding. Jax carefully wiped away a thick layer of wet dirt and sticky clay. Beneath the soil, heavily stained with decades of creeping rust and suffocating mineral deposits, was a solid surface of heavy, industrial-grade steel. "Well, I will be damned," Jax whispered, his breath catching in his throat. Smoky took a deliberate step back, sitting tall and vigilant on his haunches, his tail sweeping slowly and rhythmically through the dirt. The dog watched Jax with a look of profound satisfaction, as if to say, "I found it. Now you open it." Jax used his hands to frantically clear away more of the surrounding debris. The metal surface did not end. It was not a discarded piece of farming equipment, nor was it the rusted hood of an old tractor. It was perfectly straight, deliberately engineered, and massive. As his fingers traced the sharp, defining edge of the steel, he felt a thick, heavy-duty hinge buried deep in the clay. Jax sat back on his heels, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs with a heavy, rhythmic thud. His mind began racing through a chaotic catalog of logical possibilities. An old, forgotten storm shelter? A remnant from the region's long-dead coal mining days? A septic tank? But the structural integrity of the metal, the sheer, undeniable thickness of the steel, and the heavy, reinforced construction felt entirely different. It felt military. It felt deliberate. It felt like something designed specifically to withstand the end of the world. He looked down at the German shepherd. "You didn't just dig up a scrap pile, did you, buddy?" Smoky barked once, a sharp, validating sound that echoed through the trees. "All right," Jax said, a new, unfamiliar spark of intense purpose suddenly overriding the crushing depression of the divorce. "Let's see exactly what you found." Jax carefully navigated his way back down the slippery hillside, his mind buzzing with 1,000 unanswered questions. He walked directly into the leaning, dangerously unstable wooden barn. Inside, surrounded by rotting bales of hay and the rusted skeletons of ancient farming tools, he found what he was looking for, a heavy, flat-nosed iron shovel with a splintering wooden handle, and a long, solid steel pry bar that weighed nearly 20 pounds. He carried the heavy tools back up the grueling incline, his breath coming in short, visible white puffs in the cold air. When he reached the site, he drove the rusted blade of the shovel deep into the hardened earth beside the exposed metal. The physical labor that followed was nothing short of brutal. The mountain soil, having sat undisturbed for over half a century, had compacted into a substance nearly as hard as concrete. Thick, fibrous webs of tree roots had woven themselves tightly across the buried structure, requiring Jax to frequently abandon the shovel and hack violently at the wood with the sharp edge of the pry bar. But as the morning dragged on and the pale sun climbed higher into the slate-gray sky, Jax did not stop. He stripped off his heavy jacket, his flannel shirt rapidly darkening with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His muscles, dormant and stiff from months of inactivity and depression, screamed in absolute agony. Blisters quickly formed and popped across the hardened calluses of his palms. Blood from a scraped knuckle mixed freely with the dark mud coating his hands. Yet, for the first time since Elena had coldly handed him those divorce papers, Jax felt completely, beautifully alive. The grueling, mindless physical agony of the digging was acting as a powerful, necessary purge. With every heavy shovelful of dirt he aggressively hurled down the hillside, he felt a fraction of his suffocating grief leaving his body. He was no longer a discarded, useless husband. He was a combat engineer, and he had a mission. Smoky remained heavily involved, utilizing his powerful paws to vigorously sweep away the loose dirt that Jax broke apart, the man and the dog working in a flawless, unspoken symphony of labor. By midday, the entire perimeter of the buried object was finally exposed. Jax leaned heavily against the wooden handle of his shovel, gasping for air, his chest heaving as sweat dripped, stinging into his eyes. Laid bare beneath the Appalachian sky was a massive, rectangular steel hatch. It was staggering in its proportions, easily 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, constructed from thick, military-grade plating. It was set flawlessly flush into a thick collar of reinforced concrete that vanished deeply into the hillside. Near the bottom right corner, partially obscured by a thick, stubborn crust of oxidized rust, was a heavy, recessed, circular locking wheel. Jax dropped the shovel. It landed with a dull thud in the dirt. He approached the hatch slowly, almost reverently, dropping to his bruised and aching knees. He wiped his filthy, trembling hand across the center of the heavy steel plate. Faintly visible beneath the decades of corrosion and dirt, stamped directly into the metal, was a faded insignia, the undeniable, instantly recognizable castle logo of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. A chilling wave of goosebumps erupted across Jax's forearms. "Dad," he whispered into the empty forest, the realization striking him with the force of a physical blow. "What exactly were you building out here?" His father had been a quiet, intensely private man, a structural engineer who claimed to have spent his life building simple bridges and surveying remote county roads. But a man who surveys county roads does not have a fortified, military-grade bunker entrance buried secretly in his backyard. Jax reached out, his trembling fingers wrapping tightly around the thick, cold steel of the recessed circular handle. Moment of truth. "Smoky," he grunted, bracing his heavy boots against the concrete collar for leverage. He pulled upward with every ounce of physical strength remaining in his exhausted body. The muscles in his massive arms corded and strained to their absolute breaking point. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin, but the hatch did not yield a single millimeter. It was fused shut by 60 years of unbroken silence, rust, and extreme underground pressure. Smoky whined softly, pacing nervously around the edge of the exposed concrete. Jax released the handle, falling backward onto the grass, panting heavily. He wiped his face with the back of his mud-caked arm. "All right. Plan B." He retrieved the heavy, solid steel pry bar. He carefully wedged the sharp, flattened chisel end of the bar deep into the microscopic, dirt-filled seam between the heavy steel hatch and the reinforced concrete frame. He checked his footing, ensuring his bad knee was stabilized, and then threw his entire 200-pound body weight violently downward onto the end of the lever. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The thick steel pry bar bowed dangerously, threatening to snap violently under the immense pressure. Then, with a sound like a rifle shot echoing through the quiet valley, the ancient, hardened rubber weather seal finally ruptured. A sharp, metallic shriek tore through the air as the heavy iron hinges groaned against decades of paralyzing rust. The massive steel hatch violently jolted upward by a crucial 2 inches. Instantly, a deep, resonant, impossibly hollow echo reverberated from deep within the earth, a sound that confirmed Jax's wildest, most terrifying suspicions. There was a massive, empty void waiting beneath his boots. But it wasn't just the sound that stopped Jax's heart. It was the breath of the mountain itself. As the airtight seal broke, a sudden, powerful rush of pressurized air forcefully hissed out of the narrow opening. The air did not smell of dirt or decaying roots. It smelled remarkably sterile, carrying the distinct, unsettling scent of old, dry concrete, preserved metal, and trapped, ancient time. It was the breath of a tomb that had not been opened since the height of the Cold War. Smoky instantly stepped back, his hackles violently raising along the entire length of his spine, letting out a low, deeply cautious growl at the strange, hissing abyss. "Easy, buddy." "We're okay," Jax whispered, though his own pulse was roaring in his ears like a freight train. He readjusted his grip on the heavy steel hatch, curling his bleeding fingers firmly under the newly exposed lip. With a final, agonizing roar of physical exertion, he lifted. The heavy steel plate swung backward on its groaning hinges, slamming heavily against the dirt hillside with a ground-shaking, metallic crash. Jax instantly scrambled backward, his heart pounding violently in his throat, staring wide-eyed at the gaping, rectangular black hole that had just violently torn open the surface of his father's quiet land. He unclipped the heavy, military-issue tactical flashlight from his belt. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the heavy aluminum cylinder. He clicked the button, and a blindingly bright, pure white beam of light sliced downward into the suffocating darkness. The beam illuminated a heavy, thick-runged steel ladder bolted securely to a wall of flawlessly poured, pristine concrete. The shaft descended completely vertically, dropping 15, perhaps 20 feet straight down into the freezing earth, before opening up into a massive, shadowy, cavernous space below. Jax crept slowly to the absolute edge of the precipice, the toes of his combat boots hanging slightly over the terrifying, echoing drop. The sheer scale of the engineering was staggering. This was not a hastily dug storm cellar or a primitive root cellar. This was a highly sophisticated, fully fortified, deeply buried subterranean installation. Smoky crept to his side, peering cautiously over the edge, the dog's ears swiveling wildly as he listened to the profound, terrifying silence of the deep earth. Jax looked down into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight barely penetrating the massive space below. His old life in the city, the divorce, the betrayal, the empty bank accounts, all of it completely vanished, entirely eclipsed by the staggering magnitude of what his fiercely loyal dog had just unearthed. "Well, Smoky," Jax whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw awe and deep, instinctual fear. "I suppose we ought to go see what my father left behind." Without hesitation, the old soldier turned around, gripped the freezing, rusted steel rungs of the ladder, and began his slow, dangerous descent into the breathless, forgotten dark. The descent into the earth was a slow, agonizing journey of inches. Each time Jax Harlan's heavy combat boots struck a new steel rung, a sharp, metallic ring vibrated up his leg, echoing into the cavernous silence below. The air grew progressively colder as he moved deeper, losing the scent of the forest and taking on the sterile, dry quality of a tomb. Approximately 15 feet down, his boots finally hit a solid, level surface. The impact sent a dull thud through the concrete floor, a sound that seemed to travel for a long distance before fading into the dark. Jax stood perfectly still, his back pressed against the cold ladder, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Stay, Smoky," he called upward, his voice sounding thin and hollow in the vast space. "Wait for my signal." Above, the rectangular patch of gray Appalachian sky looked impossibly small, a distant window to a world that no longer felt real. Smoky's dark silhouette remained perched at the edge of the hatch, his ears swiveled forward, his golden eyes watching Jax with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. Jax gripped his tactical flashlight with a white-knuckled intensity and clicked it on. The high-intensity LED beam sliced through the suffocating, velvety blackness like a physical blade. As he panned the light slowly from left to right, the sheer, staggering scale of the facility began to reveal itself. This was not merely a room, it was a reinforced subterranean fortress. The walls were constructed of flawlessly poured, industrial-grade concrete, reinforced with massive vertical steel I-beams that disappeared into a ceiling of heavy corrugated metal. Dust lay over every horizontal surface, like a thick, gray shroud of velvet undisturbed for decades. Jax's boots left deep, crisp impressions in the silt as he took his first tentative steps. To his left, a long, heavy-duty workbench stretched nearly 20 feet, its surface cluttered with specialized engineering tools, massive vises, and a row of glass jars filled with sorted brass fittings. To his right, a series of towering floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units held hundreds of olive-drab canisters, each one sealed with a heavy wax coating and stamped with government serial numbers. "Smoky, come!" Jax barked. The German shepherd did not hesitate. With the agility of a predator, he navigated the vertical ladder, his claws clicking rhythmically against the steel rungs before he dropped the final few feet to land silently beside Jax. The dog immediately began a wide, sweeping patrol of the perimeter, his nose flaring as he processed the ancient, preserved scents of oil, ozone, and dry paper. Jax walked toward the center of the room, his flashlight beam landing on a massive, tarp-covered shape that dominated the floor space. He reached out, his fingers brushing the heavy, brittle canvas. With a violent tug, he ripped the cover away. Beneath it sat an industrial-grade diesel generator, a beast of a machine painted in military lusterless green. It looked brand new, its brass components still gleaming faintly beneath a thin layer of dust. "Unbelievable," Jax whispered. "This isn't a shelter. This is a command center." He turned his light toward the far wall and froze. Mounted behind a thick pane of plexiglass was a series of oversized, hand-drawn blueprints and topographical maps of the surrounding Appalachian ridges. Several locations were circled in bold, red grease pencil. One of those circles sat directly over the Harlan homestead, labeled in his father's precise, architectural script, Site 47 Bravo, Primary Seed Station. Beneath the maps sat a heavy steel desk, its surface remarkably clear of clutter except for a single, leather-bound ledger and a weathered, handwritten envelope resting dead center on the blotter. Jax's breath hitched. He recognized that handwriting instantly. It was the same disciplined, slanted script that had filled the postcards his father sent him during his first tour in Germany. Jax approached the desk with a sense of profound, almost religious awe. He set the flashlight down so the beam illuminated the desk, and with trembling fingers, he picked up the envelope. It was addressed simply to the engineer who returns. He slid a shaking thumb under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of yellowed stationery. "Jax, if you're reading this, the world has either ended or you have finally found the strength to look beneath the surface of things. I never told you the truth about my work because a secret is a burden that only one man should carry. I wasn't just a surveyor, I was part of a shadow initiative, the Appalachian Contingency. We built these stations during the height of the 1960s, not just to survive a war, but to ensure that when the dust settled, there would be men left who knew how to rebuild. This land isn't just dirt and trees, son, it is a toolbox for the future. The generator is primed, the supplies are sealed. I left it all for you, hoping you'd never need it, but knowing your heart, I suspect you've come here because you have nothing left. Remember what I taught you, an engineer doesn't look at a ruin and see an end. He sees the foundation for what comes next. Fix the world, Jax. Start with yourself." "Dad." Jax sat heavily in the rusted swivel chair behind the desk, the letter fluttering in his hand. The crushing weight of the past 6 months, the divorce, the humiliation, the feeling of being a discarded relic suddenly shifted. He wasn't a man who had been cast out. He was a man who had been called back to a post he didn't know he held. Smoky walked over and rested his heavy head on Jax's knee, letting out a low, comforting whine. Jax reached down and gripped the dog's fur, his eyes blurring with the first hot, stinging tears he had allowed himself in years. He knew, Smoky, Jax choked out. He knew I'd come back broken. He was waiting for me. The discovery of the letter ignited a dormant engine inside Jax Harlan. The lethargy that had plagued him since the courthouse vanished, replaced by a cold, methodical precision. He spent the next 6 hours in a whirlwind of activity, his military training taking complete control. He checked the fuel lines on the massive generator, finding the diesel still viable thanks to the airtight, temperature-controlled environment. He found the battery bank, a series of massive lead-acid cells, and checked the levels. At precisely 4 p.m., Jax stood before the control panel. He primed the pump, adjusted the choke, and pressed the heavy brass starter button. The starter motor groaned, a low, mechanical growl that echoed through the bunker. It coughed once, spitting a cloud of acrid smoke into the ventilation system, and then, with a triumphant, ground-shaking roar, the engine turned over. The massive machine settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum that Jax could feel in the very marrow of his bones. He flipped the primary breaker. One by one, the long, dusty fluorescent tubes overhead flickered to life, bathing the bunker in a harsh, brilliant white light. Jax squinted, his eyes adjusting to the brightness. The room was even more impressive in the light. He saw the racks of long-term medical supplies, the crates of high-grade construction tools, and a communication station equipped with a shortwave radio that looked capable of reaching the other side of the planet. Smoky barked excitedly, his tail wagging with a frantic energy as he explored the illuminated corners of their new kingdom. Jax walked to the center of the room and looked up at the ceiling. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of the mountain wind through the ventilation shafts. He realized then that he wasn't just hiding in a hole in the ground. He was standing in the most technologically advanced, well-supplied outpost in the entire state of West Virginia. Elena had taken his bank accounts, but she had left him a fortune in steel, oil, and legacy. She had taken his dignity in a courtroom, but his father had returned it to him in a bunker. "All right, soldier," Jax said, his voice now crisp and commanding, the sound of a man who finally had a mission. Phase 1 is complete. Tomorrow, we start on the cabin. This mountain is going to become a fortress. Smoky sat tall, his ears sharp, looking for all the world like he was ready to follow Jax into the mouth of hell itself. As the generator hummed a steady song of power beneath the earth, Jax Harlan finally felt the last remnants of his old life fall away. He was no longer a victim of a divorce. He was the guardian of Site 47 Bravo, and he had a lot of work to do. The heavy, subterranean hum of the generator became the heartbeat of the mountain. Over the next several weeks, Jax Harlan transformed from a man drifting in the fog of betrayal into a precision-engineered machine of restoration. Every morning at precisely 0500, before the sun had even kissed the tips of the Appalachian pines, Jax and Smoky were out of the cabin. The lethargy in Jax's limbs had been replaced by a hardened, functional strength. The constant throb in his knee was still there, but it had become a secondary noise, easily ignored in the face of his growing mission. Utilizing the professional-grade construction tools he hauled up from the bunker, heavy-duty saws, industrial drills, and stacks of preserved pressure-treated lumber, Jax began a systematic assault on the decay of the Harlan homestead. He didn't just patch the roof, he reinforced the rafters with steel brackets found in his father's toolbox. He didn't just fix the sagging porch, he rebuilt the entire foundation with concrete mixed from the bunker's dry storage bags. Smoky was more than a companion. He was a vital part of the workforce. The German shepherd learned to haul small sleds of supplies and stood as a constant, vigilant sentry while Jax worked on high ladders. The bond between them, already forged in fire, was now being tempered in the cold, honest sweat of labor. One crisp Tuesday afternoon, Jax decided it was time to re-engage with the world. He climbed into his old truck, Smoky sitting tall and proud in the passenger seat, and drove the winding, gravel-choked miles down into the small town of Pine Ridge. Pine Ridge was a town that time had largely forgotten, a single main street lined with brick buildings that had seen better days, a solitary gas station, and Miller's Hardware and Feed. As Jax pulled his truck to the curb, he noticed the way the locals paused. In a place this small, a stranger was a headline, but a man returning to the ghost cabin on the ridge was a legend in the making. The bell above the hardware store door jingled with a sharp, nostalgic ring. Sarah Miller, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen many mountain winters, looked up from a thick ledger. "Well now," she said, her voice like sandpaper on silk. "I was wondering when the mountain would spit you back out. You must be the Harlan boy." "Jax, right?" Jax touched the brim of his cap. "Just Jax, ma'am." "And this is Smoky." Smoky sat politely at Jax's heel, his tail giving a single, disciplined wag. Sarah walked around the counter, her gaze traveling from the veteran's scarred hands to the dog's intelligent eyes. "Word travels fast up here. Folks say they hear a hum coming from that ridge at night. Say you've got the old place looking like a fortress already, just doing some maintenance," Jax replied evenly. "Maintenance?" Sarah chuckled, reaching down to scratch Smoky behind the ears. "Taking care of that land is a full-time job. Your father was a quiet one, but he kept that property like it was hallowed ground." Glad to see a Harlan back in the saddle. As Jax loaded a few supplemental supplies, fresh seed for the garden and oil for the truck, a young boy, no older than 10, burst through the door, his face pale and streaked with tears. "Miss Sarah, it's Toby. He went chasing a rabbit near the old mine wash, and he didn't come back." Ma's frantic. The air in the store suddenly went cold. The mine wash was a treacherous stretch of land where the earth was honeycombed with unstable, abandoned shafts. Sarah's face hardened. "I'll call the sheriff, but he's 3 towns over on a call." Jax didn't hesitate. It wasn't a choice. It was a reflex. Where was he last seen? 10 minutes later, Jax's truck was roaring toward the edge of the mine wash. Sarah followed in her own vehicle. When they reached the jagged, rocky tree line, the boy's mother was hysterical. Screaming into the dense brush, Jax knelt beside Smoky, placing his hand on the dog's shoulder. The shepherd was already straining at the invisible leash of discipline, his nose flaring, his ears locked forward. "Smoky, find him." "Search?" The dog vanished into the undergrowth like a streak of lightning. Jax followed as fast as his knee would allow, his heart hammering. He watched Smoky work, not just running, but calculating, checking the wind, circling the scent. Suddenly, Smoky let out a sharp, rhythmic bark, the found signal. Jax pushed through a thicket of briars to find Smoky standing at the edge of a narrow, hidden sinkhole. 10 feet down, a small boy sat huddled in the dark, shivering but alive. Smoky was lying flat on his belly at the rim, his head hanging over the edge, whining softly to keep the child calm. By the time the boy was hauled up with a length of rope Jax kept in his truck, a small crowd of locals had gathered. The gratitude was overwhelming, but Jax simply nodded, patted Smoky's side, and prepared to leave. "You're a godsend, Jax Harlan," the boy's mother sobbed, hugging her son. "Don't thank me," Jax said, looking down at the mud-caked German shepherd. "Thank the dog. He's the one who never stops looking." As they drove back up toward the ridge, the sun setting in a violent explosion of orange and purple, Jax felt a strange, new warmth in his chest. He was no longer just a ghost in a cabin. He was a neighbor. He was a guardian. However, the ripple of the rescue and the rumors of the humming mountain traveled further than Jax anticipated. In the digital age, even the most remote mountain gossip finds its way to the city. 400 miles away, in a high-rise apartment that felt increasingly like a cage, Elena Harlan sat bathed in the cold blue light of a laptop screen. She was scrolling through a local Appalachian community forum, her eyes locked onto a grainy cell phone photo of Jax and Smoky standing outside the hardware store, the caption reading, "The Mountain Guardian and his hero dog." But it wasn't the headline that caught her breath. It was the background of the photo. In the bed of Jax's truck sat an industrial grade, military surplus filtration unit, a piece of equipment worth more than her current, rapidly depleting savings account. She looked at the paperwork on her desk, the foreclosure notice for the suburban house, the failed investment reports from Julian. Her hands began to shake, not with fear, but with a predatory, desperate greed. "Julian," she called out into the hallway, her voice sharp and calculating. "Pack a bag. It turns out that worthless mountain dirt is hiding a lot more than a drafty cabin. And I think it's time I went to collect what's mine." Back on the ridge, Smoky sat on the porch, his head suddenly snapping toward the south. He let out a low, vibrating growl that barely disturbed the silence of the woods. He didn't know the names Elena or Julian, but he knew the scent of a threat. And he knew that the peace they had built was about to be challenged by the very person who had tried to bury them. The morning mist was still clinging to the jagged throat of the valley, thick and suffocating like a wet woolen blanket, when the first unnatural sound disturbed the ancient silence of the ridge. It wasn't the rhythmic, organic thud of a falling branch or the distant, lonely cry of a red-tailed hawk circling the heights. It was the low, intrusive hum of a high-performance engine, a sound that carried the arrogant cadence of the city into a world that had long ago forgotten the taste of gasoline and asphalt. Jax Harlan was standing on the newly reinforced porch of the cabin, a heavy porcelain mug of black coffee warming his calloused palms, when he saw the glint of sunlight reflecting off a polished windshield nearly a mile down the winding gravel road. Beside him, Smoky didn't need a command to transition into a state of high-intensity vigilance. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, his muscular body going as rigid and unyielding as a statue carved from dark stone, and a low, vibrating rumble began to build deep within his powerful chest, a warning that resonated through the very floorboards of the porch and into the soles of Jax's boots. The sleek, obsidian black SUV crawled up the final, treacherous incline like a predatory insect, its tires crunching loudly over the fresh gravel Jax had painstakingly spread only days before. It came to a halt at the edge of the clearing, looking impossibly clean and entirely alien against the backdrop of the rugged, weather-beaten barn and the deep, verdant green of the Appalachian forest. For a long, pulsing minute, the vehicle simply sat there, its tinted windows offering no glimpse of the occupants, while the mountain wind whistled through the tall grass as if trying to blow the intruder away. Then, the driver's side door opened with a quiet, expensive click, and Julian Vance stepped out, his Italian leather loafers instantly sinking into the soft, damp mountain soil. A moment later, the passenger door followed suit, and Elena Harlan emerged, her designer coat wrapped tightly around her as she squinted against the sharp, unfiltered brightness of the high-altitude sun. Jax didn't move an inch. He stood at the top of the porch steps, the steam from his coffee rising in a slow, swirling plume that mimicked the mountain fog. He watched them with a terrifying, detached clarity, his military mind instinctively mapping the distance and assessing the threat. Elena looked exactly as she had in the courtroom, composed, polished, and radiate with an aura of inherited importance. But as she surveyed the property, her eyes betrayed a flickering, desperate hunger that she couldn't quite mask. Her gaze traveled from the repaired roof of the cabin to the sturdy, brand-new fence line of the pasture, finally settling on the massive, newly painted doors of the barn. The worthless ruin she had discarded 6 months ago was now a thriving, fortified homestead, pulsing with a vitality that she could clearly sense but could never hope to own. "Jax," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard with a practiced, hollow warmth that made Smoky's hackles rise in a violent, jagged line along his spine. Jax slowly lowered his mug. His eyes locked onto hers with the unwavering intensity of a man who had seen the sun rise over a dozen battlefields. "You're a long way from the city. Elena. This road wasn't meant for tires that thin." Julian Vance stepped forward, adjusting the knot of his silk tie as if he were walking into a boardroom rather than a clearing in the wilderness. "Mr. Harlan, we aren't here for a social visit. We've been reviewing the final property disclosures from the divorce proceedings, and it seems there were some significant omissions regarding the structural assets on this land." Elena walked toward the porch, her expensive heels clicking awkwardly on the uneven stones. She stopped 10 feet away, her eyes fixed on Smoky, who was now standing at the very edge of the top step. his teeth partially bared in a silent, deadly promise. He's still as mean as ever. I see, she remarked, her voice trembling slightly despite her bravado. He's not mean. Elena, Jax replied, his tone as heavy and cold as the river stones in the hearth. He's discerning. He knows when someone is here to build, and he knows when someone is here to scavenge. Now, why don't you tell me the truth before you waste any more of my morning? You didn't drive 4 hours to talk about paperwork. Elena's composure fractured for a fraction of a second, the mask of the successful investor slipping to reveal the raw, panicked greed of a woman whose house of cards was falling. I heard about the child, Jax. I heard about the dog finding him near the mines. But more importantly, I heard about the equipment you've been bringing in. Industrial filters, high-output communications, things that don't belong in a mountain shack. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a sharp, predatory whisper. People in town are talking about a bunker, Jax. A government-grade installation buried right here under our land. It's my land. Elena, Jax corrected her, the words slicing through the air with the finality of a guillotine blade. The judge was very clear on that point. You took the houses that had plumbing and the accounts that had numbers. You told the world this dirt was a liability? You signed it away with a smile because you thought I'd crawl back to you when the winter hit. Julian Vance cleared his throat, slipping a hand into his pocket in a way that he probably thought looked intimidating. Actually, Jax, the law is quite complex when it comes to undisclosed federal infrastructure on private property. If your father was part of a classified program, as the records we've unearthed suggest, then the value of this site was never properly assessed during the division of assets. We are prepared to file a motion to reopen the settlement based on fraudulent concealment of property value. Jax felt a strange, quiet laughter bubbling up in his chest, not a sound of amusement, but a dark, powerful realization of just how small these people truly were. He looked down at Smoky, and in that moment, he realized that the things Elena had taken from him, the money, the status, the suburban comfort, were nothing more than dead weight he had been dragging through the desert for 35 years. By trying to destroy him, she had accidentally liberated him. She had stripped away the clutter and the lies, leaving him with nothing but his soul, his dog, and his father's legacy. You want the bunker? Jax asked, his voice echoing with a newfound authority that seemed to vibrate from the mountain itself. You want to talk about value? He stepped down the first porch move, and Smoky moved with him in a flawless, synchronized shadow. Elena and Julian both instinctively recoiled, their polished city exterior crumbling in the face of a man who truly had nothing left to fear. Value isn't a number in a ledger. Elena, Jax said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble. Value is the heat from a fire you built with your own hands when the temperature hits 10 below. Value is the look in this dog's eyes when he pulls you back from a nightmare. My father built that station for people who knew how to survive, for people who understood that when the world gets loud and greedy, the only thing that matters is the ground you stand on and the people you die to protect. He walked toward them, his limp nearly invisible now, fueled by a terrifying, righteous energy. You came here because you're broke. Because Julian's investments failed and your city life is drying up. You came here to rob a dead man's grave because you're too weak to build anything of your own. Now, listen here, Julian started, but Jax was already in his space. A mountain of a man who smelled of pine smoke and hard work. No, you listen, Jax interrupted, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. There is no lawsuit. There is no claim. My father didn't leave this to the Harlan family. He left it to the Harlan engineer. He left it to me because he knew I was the only one with the heart to guard it. If you set foot on this property again, I won't call a lawyer. I'll let Smoky decide what to do with the intruders. And I promise you, he doesn't care about your silk ties or your legal motions. Elena stared at him, and for the first time in her life, She saw the man her husband had always been, not the quiet, broken veteran she thought she could manage, but the warrior who had cleared paths through minefields while she slept in silk sheets. She saw the strength she had tried to extinguish, now burning brighter than ever in the cold mountain air. She looked at the bunker hill, then at the dog, and finally back at the man who had once loved her. She realized, with a soul-crushing certainty, that she had no power here. She was a ghost in a living world, a relic of a life that Jax Harlan had already outgrown. Go back to the city. Elena, Jax said, his voice softening with a touch of genuine pity that stung her worse than any insult. Go find a new game to play, because this mountain doesn't recognize your currency. And it certainly doesn't recognize you. Without waiting for a response, Jax turned his back on them, a gesture of absolute dismissal that left them standing in the mud like abandoned statues. He walked back up the steps, and Smoky followed, the dog giving one final, deep bark that echoed through the valley, signaling the end of the conversation. The SUV doors slammed, no longer expensive clicks, but desperate thuds. The engine roared, tires spinning and spitting gravel as Julian Vance turned the vehicle around in a panicked scramble. Jax stood on the porch, his hand resting on Smoky's head, watching the black speck descend the mountain until it was swallowed by the pines and the rising dust. The silence of the ridge returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a victory won without a single shot being fired. It was the silence of a man who had finally reclaimed his throne. Jax looked at the coffee in his mug, now cold, and poured it out onto the grass. Well, Smoky, he whispered, his voice steady and calm. I think the air is finally clear up here. Smoky leaned his heavy head against Jax's leg, his tail giving a single, contented thump. The mountain was quiet, the cabin was strong, and the bunker was ready. Jax Harlan had been left with nothing, and in doing so, he had found everything he ever needed. He was no longer a victim of a divorce, he was the master of his own destiny, standing guard over a secret that the world could never understand. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the vast, unbreakable beauty of the Appalachians, the old soldier realized that the greatest treasure wasn't buried in the hill, it was the strength he had found in the climb. The departure of the black SUV left a lingering, oily scent of exhaust that hung in the humid mountain air for a long time, a final fading reminder of a world Jax Harlan no longer recognized and a woman he no longer knew. But as the afternoon progressed, the atmosphere atop the ridge began to shift with a violent, unsettling urgency that had nothing to do with human greed. The sky, which had been a vibrant, crystalline blue only hours before, began to bruise into a deep, sickly shade of violet, then eventually into a terrifying electric green. The birds, usually a constant chorus of life in the surrounding pines, suddenly fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, the air becoming so thick and stagnant that every inhalation felt like a physical effort. Smoky, who had been resting his head on his paws after the confrontation, stood up abruptly, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. He let out a low, mournful whine, his amber eyes scanning the southwestern horizon where a wall of impenetrable, charcoal clouds was rapidly swallowing the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Range. Jax recognized that look in the dog's eyes. It was the same look Smoky had given him moments before a sandstorm had nearly buried their convoy in the Al-Anbar province. It was the look of a creature that understood a catastrophic change was coming, a force of nature that no amount of steel or concrete could truly negotiate with. Jax limped over to the porch railing, his gaze fixed on the approaching darkness. The barometer in his mind, calibrated by years of outdoor survival, was screaming. This wasn't just a mountain squall, this was the big one Sarah Miller had warned him about. A supercell storm system capable of turning peaceful creeks into raging rivers and centuries-old trees into toothpicks. All right. Smoky, Jax whispered, the old combat engineer's focus locking into place. Let's get the site secured. Go to the bunker and wait for me. The German shepherd barked once, a sharp, disciplined sound, and sprinted toward the hillside. Jax followed with a grim determination, moving through the cabin and the barn with a checklist of military precision. He latched the heavy wooden shutters he had built for the cabin windows, secured the livestock in the reinforced lower stalls of the barn, and hauled the last of the loose equipment into the subterranean depths. By the time he reached the steel hatch of the bunker, the first gust of wind hit the ridge with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, violent roar that made the massive pines groan and bend like reeds. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, and then the sky simply opened up. The rain was not a sequence of drops, it was a solid, horizontal wall of water that instantly erased the horizon, turning the world into a chaotic, gray-black abyss. Jax climbed down the ladder, pulling the heavy steel hatch shut and rotating the locking wheel until the rubber seals hissed into place. The silence of the bunker was immediate and profound, a jarring contrast to the elemental fury raging just a few feet above their heads. The only sound was the steady, comforting thrum of the diesel generator and the muffled, distant rumble of thunder that felt more like a vibration in the bedrock than a noise in the air. Smoky sat in the center of the illuminated concrete room, his tail giving a single, steady wag as Jax approached. They were safe. They were prepared. They had enough food, water, and power to last for months if necessary. Jax sat at his father's desk, the yellowed letter still resting on the blotter, and felt a deep, resonant sense of peace. He had spent his entire life building things for a government that eventually discarded him, and he had spent 35 years building a marriage for a woman who eventually tried to erase him. But here, in the cold, honest heart of the mountain, he had finally built something that was his own. He was the engineer of his own sanctuary, but the peace was short-lived. A sudden, crackling burst of static erupted from the shortwave radio on the communication desk. Jax frowned, stepping over to the console and adjusting the frequency dial. Through the layers of atmospheric interference and the roar of the storm, a frantic, breaking voice began to filter through the speakers. It was Sarah Miller's voice, and it was laced with a raw, naked terror he had never heard from the hardened mountain woman. Emergency. Anyone on this frequency? The bridge at Pine Creek has washed out. The lower valley is flooding. We have 10 families trapped at the community center, and the roof is failing. We can't get out. The roads are gone. Please, if anyone can hear this. Jax stared at the radio, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the heavy steel door of the hatch, then back at the blinking lights of the control panel. He knew that valley. He knew that the community center sat in a natural bowl that would become a lake within the hour. And he knew that he was the only person within 50 miles who possessed the equipment, the training, and the fortified shelter to save those people. Smoky, Jax said, his voice dropping into the low, deadly calm of a mission briefing. Change of plans. Gear up. The next 3 hours were a blurred, adrenaline-drenched nightmare of wind and water. Jax utilized the industrial-grade winch on his truck and the specialized recovery gear from the bunker to navigate the disintegrating mountain roads. Smoky acted as his eyes, barking a warning every time a mudslide shifted the earth or a fallen pine blocked the path. They reached the valley floor just as the river breached its banks, the water swirling dangerously around the tires of the heavy truck. One by one, Jax and Smoky navigated the chaos, pulling families from the rising tide, hauling children through the freezing rain, and loading the elderly into the back of the pickup. The locals looked at Jax not as the broken veteran or the stranger in the cabin, but as a literal titan of salvation. And when the last of the trucks couldn't climb the muddy slopes of the ridge, Jax did the unthinkable. He led them to the hill. He led them to the secret. The townspeople of Pine Ridge stood in awe as the massive, military-grade hatch swung open, revealing the warm, electric glow of the subterranean fortress. Children who had been shivering in the cold were suddenly wrapped in olive-drab wool blankets. Parents who had been terrified of the rising water found themselves sitting on crates of emergency rations, drinking hot coffee brewed on the bunker's electric range. The mountain guardian had opened his gates, and for the first time in 60 years, the Appalachian Contingency Project was fulfilling its true purpose. It wasn't just a place to survive a war, it was a place to protect a community. When the sun finally rose the following morning, it revealed a landscape that had been fundamentally reshaped. The valley was a mess of tangled timber and receding mud, and the roads were scarred by the fury of the storm. But as the people of Pine Ridge climbed out of the bunker and looked across the clearing, they didn't see destruction. They saw a new beginning. They saw Jax Harlan standing on the hillside, his hand resting on the head of a mud-caked German shepherd, and they knew that as long as those two were on the ridge, the mountain would always have a protector. Sarah Miller walked up to Jax, her face weary but filled with a profound, quiet respect. She looked at the hatch, then at the man who had saved her town. "You didn't have to show us this, Jax. You could have kept your secret. You could have stayed safe in your hole while the rest of us washed away." Jax looked out over the ridges, the golden light of the morning illuminating the vast, unbreakable beauty of his home. He thought about Elena and the life he had left behind, a life built on the sand of greed and the hollow promises of the city. Then he looked at the families gathered in his yard, the people who now looked at him as a brother and a hero. "My father didn't build this to hide from the world, Sarah," Jax said, his voice carrying a deep, emotional resonance. "He built it so that when the world got dark, there would be someone left to turn the lights back on. A man doesn't find his value in what he takes. He finds it in what he's willing to share when the storm hits." The value of this story, the lesson that Jax Harlan learned in the silence of the bunker and the roar of the Appalachian wind, is a truth that every one of us needs to hear. We live in a world that tells us our worth is defined by our bank accounts, our titles, and the things we can possess. We are told that when we lose those things, we are nothing. But Jax Harlan is proof that you can lose your house, your savings, and your past, and still be the wealthiest man on the mountain. True strength isn't the absence of scars, it's the ability to use those scars as a roadmap to rebuild something better. Resilience is not just surviving the storm, it's becoming the shelter for those who can't survive it on their own. Loyalty is a currency that never devalues. Elena had the millions, but she was bankrupt of spirit. Jax had nothing but a dog and a decaying cabin, and yet he held the keys to a kingdom of honor. If you find yourself in your own personal storm today, if you feel like the world has taken everything from you and left you alone in the dark, remember Smoky. Remember the dog who refused to stop digging until he found the treasure. Sometimes, the life you think you've lost is just the debris that needs to be cleared away so you can find the foundation your father laid for you long ago. Keep digging, keep building, and never, ever forget that the most powerful thing you can own is a heart that refuses to break. As the morning grew warmer, the families began the slow process of returning to the valley to rebuild their homes, but they didn't go alone. Jax and Smoky went with them, bringing the tools, the power, and the engineering skill that the mountain had provided. The Harlan homestead was no longer a place of isolation. It was the heart of a community. And as Jax stood in the mud of the valley floor, his knee aching but his spirit soaring, he realized that he hadn't just saved the town. He had saved himself. If this journey of Jax and Smoky touched your soul, if it reminded you that your value is inherent and your resilience is limitless, then, please, let us know you were here. Comment a 1 if you believe that true loyalty can change the world, or a 0 if this story gave you the strength to start rebuilding your own life today. Your stories and your presence mean everything to us, and we read every single word you share from around the globe. Don't forget to subscribe to Hero Veteran Dogs and hit that notification bell, because there are so many more stories of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between soldiers and their four-legged heroes waiting to be told. Until next time, stay strong, stay loyal, and remember, no matter how deep you're buried, you have the strength to rise. Smoky and Jax will see you in the next one.